Okay, great. What's that? Oh, excellent. That's my sister-in-law. Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's the cool girl with that nature.
Should we go ahead and get started, Ellie, or wait, just? Okay, I was just gonna say a quick word of intro and let me know when you're ready. All set? Great. Well, hi everyone, welcome. My name is Michael Berry. I'm chair of the Political Science Department here at CU Denver. And I'm here today to introduce Dr. Steve DelCastillo as part of our Political Science lecture series. And so we're really excited to have everyone in attendance today, and those of you who are joining us online as well, welcome. And we hope to have some time for Q&A at the end of the talk. We have this room until 1:45. And so we'll looking forward to a good conversation and discussion. So Steve DelCastillo is the director for the Center in New Directions in Politics and Public Policy here at CU Denver. It's a great graduate program. I would highly recommend you check it out. And he is an economist who has a PhD from the University of Colorado. His work and research has focused on labor economics and political economy. He has prior work experience in the governor's office, the Center for Creative Leadership, and with Kaiser Permanente. His talk today is The Rich Got Richer, the Politics of Economic Inequality, and it comes at a good time as Dr. DelCastillo has recently taught a course on the political economy of inequality, which focused on inequities at the individual, institutional, and national levels. And he's currently working on a book focused on a systems approach to understanding political economy. So we're thrilled to have Steve here with us today, and just also want to mention our next political science public lecture event will take place in 2 weeks on Wednesday, April the 13th. The focus of that talk will be the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, and we'll have Dr. Betsy Jose and Dr. Christoph Stiefus present on Putin's war in Ukraine explained. And again, that'll be Wednesday, April 14th at 12:30 p.m. and that will be a streaming event. So if you're interested in attending that lecture series, we've had many great ones this academic year. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Steve today with this talk, and really looking forward to that upcoming talk next month as well. So with that, Steve, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Barry. I appreciate the introduction. And welcome to everyone. We had some beautiful weather up until today. And so all of a sudden it decided to start raining. So I'm sure probably folks have been detained a little bit. But anyway, welcome to everybody. And to be able to share some of the work that I've been doing and the research I've been doing around the issue of inequality. But before I do that, I just want you to know that once I knew that I was going to do this lecture, I of course contacted my family tree. In the Latino culture, family is very important, and so I'm just kidding. But I do have two family members here today: my daughter Tasha and my grandson Ryder are back there. So welcome to them, and welcome to everybody. I see Rodney, one of our students, and thank you for the chance to be here. First of all, the purpose of and the focus of my lecture today will be on the whole area of political and economic inequality. But before I do that, I'd like to do kind of a little bit of, and I do, as Professor Berry mentioned, is I'm the director for the Center for New Directions in Politics and Public Policy. And the lecture topic today is The Rich Got Richer, the Politics of Economic Inequality. And we'll see what that means for us as a society, as a country, as individuals, for example, and as a state, and here in Colorado. First of all, I do want to welcome everybody who's online. Ellie, do you know how many folks we have online?
So far, 11.
Oh, 11, great.
4 likes.
Okay, great, excellent, excellent. Those are all my 11 cousins. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so before I move into the lecture, I just really want to put a little plug in for our Center for New Directions in Politics and Public Policy. We are a part of the Political Science Department. Our mission is to enable students to get their applied master's degree in political science. We do have the master's in political science, and we actually have 2 certificates, one in nonprofit and public community leadership and one in labor leadership. Our program is, we've had some really good feedback from our students about the instructors just because of the knowledge that they bring to the classroom and to the lectures. So the 4 things we really focus on with our MA program is the application of political science content skills and strategies that impact politics and public policy. We really want to look at how is it that we as a group can impact politics and public policy. We have provide practical experiences. In some cases, our students do internships, and we encourage that whenever possible. We provide experience in the public, nonprofit, and private sectors. And then we provide competencies for students who are interested in pursuing different careers in public policy. For example, policy analysts, practitioners, researchers, folks running for political office. We actually have some students, some graduates that served in political office and then in government relations. So we have kind of the gamut of folks interested in the whole area of politics and public policy. So that's our center. Now, excuse me, over the last, several years, at least the last decade or two during my career, I've always been interested in the whole issue of, first of all, of politics and public policy, but also on the topic of inequality. I'm an economist by training, but I'm a social scientist by practice. And what that means is I've really integrated political science, psychology, sociology, into my work, into my research. And with all of that in mind, one of the things that I've come across, there are some issues and some questions that kind of have arisen over the last several years. The first is, when we talk about inequality, first of all, let me share this problem statement with you. Political economy is a connection between politics and economics. How do those 2 things connect? Now, I was trained as a neoclassical economist, and what that means is politics don't really play a role in economics. And of course, we all know that's not the case. But since the 1970s, the income and wealth gap between the upper 10% of the population and the rest of the population has grown significantly. Now, I recall in 1970 is the year I graduated from college, and there were several things that were going on at the time. And for example, that really shifted the economic thinking and political thinking for us. For example, in 1973, that was really a year of significant events. First, it was really in January of that year, North and South Vietnam signed the treaty in Paris, ending the Vietnam War. The U.S. stayed for another couple of years. But with that came the fact that we, up to that point, of course, had been building up the economy through the use of military spending. Military spending became a large part of gross domestic product. So then there was layoff, of course, there was reduction in force in the military force, and of course all you have folks coming into the labor force. And with that was an increase in unemployment. Then you also, in 1973, you had the war between Israel and the Arab states. And the U.S. at that time supported Israel. And because of that, after the war, the Arab states said they were pretty upset. And as a result of that, said we're going to reduce the supply of oil then that we're going to ship to the U.S. Of course, when you reduce the supply, you increase the price. So it really is very reminiscent of today, or today is reminiscent of then, in the sense that many of the things that are going on right now, for example, in terms of the inflation at 7.5%, really is nothing compared to that time period went up to 10 and 12%, 13% in some cases. And then, of course, the other issue is the unemployment. Now, in economic terms, that was really kind of inconsistent with the historical process. That is, usually when you had low unemployment, you had high interest rates, and then vice versa. You had, as unemployment increased, inflation decreased because of the central bank. We won't get into all of that, but there was. So today is very similar to what happened then, through the 1970s, in 1975 through 1980 and so forth. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But there were 4 questions, burning questions, that I thought, for me anyway, were important in terms of this lecture. One is that what explains this dramatic increase in the gap? What happened? What happened that there was such a significant increase in this gap? Because as a nation, that was something we had only seen at one other time during the Gilded Age, and then, of course, during the 1970s. Excuse me, here recently in the last 20, 30 years. The other question is, what have been the political and economic impacts of this gap? And there have been, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. What are the implications of such a gap on democracy? And what are some of the political and public policy strategies that can be pursued to deal with this gap? We'll talk about that. I've got some recommendations that I'll share with you. Now, in my work and my research, as I thought about the work, what I've been working on is what I call a 4-pillar framework for political and economic fairness. For me, the idea of fairness is a really key concept, is a really key idea. That's, in my judgment, one of the stable concepts or ideas of our country, of the United States. The idea of fairness and the fact that we treat, theoretically, we treat folks fairly, and that allows them to move depending on their level of skill, the level of effort, and so forth and so on. But fairness is a key concept, at least for me. So with that, I developed this model, and looks at this pillar, 4 pillars, and the guiding principles behind the pillars. So pillar 1 is really, and if you're going to see, you'll see on the pillars, you'll see, by the way, this is the top view of the pillar. I'm not that graphically talented to be able to really draw pillars. So this is the top of the pillar. So pillar 1 is, and both on the right side, you see economic fairness. On the left side, you'll see political fairness. Pillar 1 is ensuring economic fairness. And we'll see what that means. Then pillar 2 is promoting economic growth. Obviously, as a society, we want to be able to, and as a country, we want to be able to grow economically. Now, we'll talk about what that means. Then, shifting to the left, pillar 3 is eliminating citizen alienation. I don't know that anybody would disagree with the fact that we probably have been, we are currently in a very divisive kind of situation right now in our country for a variety of reasons. Part of that has to do with a sense of alienation that I'll talk about in just a minute. And then the 4th pillar is protecting democracy. After all, that's really what makes us distinct from a lot of other countries and a lot of other societies. And of course, as we know, given today, we know that's one of the things that people are observing. So really quickly, just want to give you some definitions so we're all kind of on the same wavelength here. Is political economy is really the interaction of politics and economics. And that's really, although the neoclassical school would say politics should not play a role, it really does. and we'll see how. So it's really the interaction of politics and economics. Inequality is really about really the distribution of resources in our society. How do we distribute resources in our society so we have to be able to measure the extent to which we have fairness in our society? Economic inequality relates specifically to issues around economics, specifically around income and wealth, again, that I'll share with you in just a minute. Let's see, I've got here, okay. And politics really is about influencing others. What can I do? What is it that I need to do to be able to help you understand my viewpoint and help you vote for my bill, help you vote for my stance, whatever the case happens to be? Of course, public policy are those policies that really look at, for example, things like legislation, law, and so forth. So I just wanted to make sure that we're all together as far as the definitions. Now, as you might imagine, there are conflicting views about inequality. That is, the cause. What causes inequality? And there are four major schools, and we covered this in my class. First of all, there is the conservative view. The conservative view says, inequality is just part of life. It's in philosophical terms, in the schools of philosophy, it's called the positive approach. It's really just part of nature. You have this haves and have-nots, but that's just nature. That's the way we are as human beings. And really to try and disrupt that kind of thinking is going to cause some issues around our society in terms of allocating resources in our society. So their pushback is, okay, if we want efficiency in our society, in our economic systems, we're not sure how much we want to really be concerned about issues of equity, because you're pulling away from efficiency, and that in itself creates other issues. But primarily the conservative viewpoint is that's the way life is. The liberal worldview is, people are not at fault. Sometimes things happen to people, and the question is, how do we react to that? And as a result of that, they're saying sometimes we need intervention and kinds of strategies to help folks, for example, who've had a hard time. There's been a storm here, we need to help them. There's been a war there, we need to help them, and so forth and so on. That's really about providing some kind of interventionist strategies. Then we have the neoliberal viewpoint, and the neoliberal viewpoint, and that's really something, as we'll talk about in just a minute, that was espoused by Milton Friedman back in the 70s, because that's another thing that happened during the 70s is the rise of neoliberalism, and we'll see what that means. But essentially, the neoliberal thought is that inequality is due to overregulation and government spending. We have too many regulations here in our society, with our government and so forth. And that really, what that does is that stymies creativity, that stymies the entrepreneurs, et cetera. And by the way, we're spending too much money, government is spending too much money. And as a result, the thinking is that it's really the private sector that is much more effective and much more efficient in terms of delivering services. For example, education. Education probably should be the domain of the private sector, according to the neoliberal thinking. And then you have the radical worldview that really focuses on moving from equality of opportunity to equality of outcomes. Okay, then also the fact that, and this is more, inequalities caused by the exploitation of the capitalist system. That's, as you might suspect, is more the radical viewpoint. Some folks would call it Marxist, but that's really the idea behind the radical viewpoint. Now, just real quickly, understanding inequality, I want to look at a couple of things here. One is the dimensions of inequality. I'm just going to mention those. I won't get into those today. Around class, race, gender, and abilities. There's no question about that. But I really will focus on the drivers of inequality, as we're going to see. As you're going to see, globalization, financialization, weakening of unions, neoliberalism, and technological change. And we're going to see how those are really the causes of inequality, or some major causes. Just really quickly, I want to, because one of the issues that always comes up is, how about technology? What role does technology play? There's, for a long time, there was the thinking that technology really doesn't play that much of a part in terms of inequality. But now, some of the research that's come out here recently, in fact, really points to two areas. One is, for example, when you look at labor and technology, for example, in an organization, it can be a private organization, it can be a government organization, and so forth and so on. But especially in the private sector. Private sector pays taxes on labor. So, for example, federal and payroll taxes. But they're able to write off the technology side through depreciation. Well, what does that mean? Well, if I own a business, I probably will want to have more computers than I have people. And which, you ask the question, well, how can you have more computers than people? Who's going to use the computers if you don't have people? But anyway, the point is that there are some tax breaks, as we're going to see, that the private sector can use as part of the depreciation write-offs when they pay their taxes. And then we're going to see how technology has contributed to the inequality gap. I just wanted to throw that out as a kind of a side note. We'll come back to that. But then the three levels of inequality, and the person who really has done a lot of work in this area is Heather Boucher. Dr. Boucher she was professor at Yale. She started the Center for Equitable Growth out of Washington, D.C. She now serves in the Biden administration in their Council of Economic Advisors. But she points out inequality at three levels. So it's not just inequality overall, the catch-all, but rather at the individual level, at the institutional level, and at the national level. So for example, what do we mean by inequality at the individual level? Well, let's look at what happens when you have, for example, issues around in the education field. What happens when you have issues around access to, for example, entrepreneurs having access to capital, et cetera. She writes that, and she actually has played off of the work of Raj Chetty, who's an economist at Harvard, who's done some tremendous work around issues around inequality. And according to Chetty and both Boucher and Chetty, that one is, when you have inequality at the individual level, really what you're talking about is hindering productivity and growth. That is, we have people in this room, for example, who are probably potential entrepreneurs. But for example, let's say that you were going to a school where you don't have access to, let's say, computers. You don't have access to equipment, et cetera, that other more well-to-do schools have. What does that do? Well, you don't have, for example, you don't have access to internet. That seems a little kind of extreme given today, but there are, in fact, areas where students don't have access to the internet. As a result, you're really looking at what she calls it blocking flows of people, of ideas, and new capital. Essentially, and Chetty calls it the lost Einsteins. The folks who really, and he does a lot of work around issues of the group that I won't get into today, but around who gets the patents, who are the folks that get the patents. And even though, for example, they may have the same level of education, et cetera, the folks who come from well-to-do backgrounds are the ones who are more likely, 3 to 4 times more likely to get patents. And as a result, obviously, you have the impact on the skills, talent, and innovation. So, with the pillar 1, ensuring economic fairness, issues around how do we ensure access to equitable resources like wages and salaries, to wealth generating resources, for example, real estate, retirement programs, and so forth. How is it that, for example, the middle-class American generates wealth normally? One is obviously if they retire, if they have a retirement program, but they don't see that until later in life. The answer to that is, of course, real estate, your home. You know, usually the house is the basis of equity. And obviously, depending on the situation, your equity rises. And so that's how the average middle-class family generates wealth, is through that. And of course, access to educational training resources and access to technology are issues around economic fairness. I recently, or just this past weekend, went to a Latino Economic Summit here, actually at CCD, and we're talking about the issues around access to the internet and to technology. That's an important part of essentially ensuring economic fairness. Now, you know, most of us have been raised to think in terms of we live in a society where we can do better than our parents. That's called social mobility, because I have access to education, theoretically anyway, access to education, access to probably maybe some capital if I want to start a business, etc. The point is, I probably can do, I will do better than my parents. At least that's been the case historically. We call that social mobility. And it's really about the ability to shift from one level to another. You can even shift downwards or across, etc. The point is, you have flexibility to do that. And so part of our American dream has always been, hey, I can move up if I want to. And essentially, the mantra has always been, I will do better than my parents. Well, let's look at something here. Raz Chetty calls it the fading American dream. And what he does, what you have here on the x-axis, you have the years of birth of American cohorts. And on the, let me clear this up. And on the y-axis, you have the percentage of children earning more than their parents. So for example, somebody born in 1940, you can see that there were 90% of that group earned more than the parents, but you can see how it leveled off as time moved on, and then through the 1950s, children born in those areas. So think about it, 1940s, and the work and the research that he has done here is he looks at them at 35 years of age. So, for example, somebody born in 1940 at 35 would be 1975. That's when you begin to see the decline in terms of being able to do better than your parents. And so, and you can see all the way, for example, somebody born in 1980, look what's happened to them. Okay? I'm not going to get to that part. Now, in Colorado, we all live here. It's a beautiful state. Everybody wants to live here. Everybody wants to be here, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at the data around educational achievement, the data tells us that Colorado is one of the highest, or has one of the highest rates of BAs, Bachelors of Arts, or bachelor's degrees in the country. It's true. If you look at on the left side, left column, you'll see that we're behind only Massachusetts, you know, in that area. That Massachusetts has the highest level at 44%, and of course, Massachusetts has Harvard, MIT, so forth and so on. So that's not anything surprising. But look at Colorado. Now, if you go to the right column, if you look at the educational funding levels there, the three levels, preschool, elementary, or public schools, and state funding for higher ed, you'll see that actually we don't do all that well in paying for education in Colorado. You can see, for example, at the higher ed level, we rank 44th in the country. And in public school funding, we rank 31st. And then in preschool funding, we are 40% lower than the U.S. In that data they looked at, they didn't have the rankings. They just had the overall the median. These are all median incomes. Now, median it's not the same thing as average, or mean. It's a difference between, it's 50% fall above that level and 50% fall below that level. Now, so you ask the question, how is it that Colorado has such a high level of BAs at such relatively low funding levels? The answer to that is, and we call it the Colorado paradox, is because you have such an in-migration of people coming in. Quite frankly, oftentimes what you have is young people finishing their degrees, moving to Colorado to enjoy the environment, hiking, camping, skiing, et cetera, all of those kinds of things. So we have several folks coming in from out of state, and that's what begins to explain this Colorado paradox. Now, with that in mind, the question is, okay, so what do we do about it? Well, we really have to look at, as we're going to see, the concept of growing your own. How do we kind of grow our own here in Colorado? Not to say that people shouldn't move here, it's only to say that we should have a more fair distribution of the BAs that would include folks coming from out of state, but also folks in state. Now, there's always the question of the middle class. What do we mean by the middle class? Well, excuse me, the way we break it down is we take it could either for income or wealth, is we break it up into what we call quintiles. 20%, as you can see here, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 100%. The three middle quintiles, 40, 60, and 80, the quintiles 2, 3, and 4, which make up about 60% of the population here, would be considered to be middle class. Okay, so now, if you were kind of drew a graph, you would have this distribution, and that's kind of what one would expect. Now, whoops, I keep touching this computer here. Here's what we know, that since 1971 to 2019, about almost a 50-year period there, we saw the middle class shrink from approximately 61%, 60% to 50%. 51, just over 51%. So you ask the question, what does that mean? And why did that happen? And what are the implications, for us, as a country? So that's one of the things we'll get into here. So when folks say the middle class, this is really what they mean. You have those three quintiles, the group, about 60% of the population. And why is that important? Think about it for just a minute. Is if you have the 20%, and you have the top 20%, the wealthy can only buy so much. The low-income folks don't have all the resources to be able to buy that much. So where does the purchasing power come from? It comes from the middle class. 2/3 of our economy comes from from consumption. So that is really where we as a country have decided to spend our money. Just real quickly, I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 slides here. This is the shrinking middle class. As you can see here, I guess you can hear me if I'm over here, right, Ellen? If you can see here, you can see well, I guess I can just stay here at the computer. You can see first of all, on the left side, now this is data from 2018. This is from the Pew Research Center. Excuse me. And you can see the income, the gaps in income from 1970 through 2018. Then this is where we talk about the shrinking middle class. That is the proportion of that goes to the middle class as it can drop from the same time period, 1970 to 2018. Just another one, the shrinking middle class. As you can see here, the top 5% of earners have increased their incomes at a rate faster than everybody else. Same thing with for example, the rate of growth. Again, the more wealthy get wealthier. And just real quickly, this is one of the ways that we look at distribution of income is called the Gini coefficient. And what that does is it looks at kind of how much of what proportion of the wealth is owned by what part of the population. So theoretically, if you have a Gini coefficient of 0, there is no disparity, there is no inequality. 100 would be the opposite, of course, or 1 would be essentially total inequality. So the lower you have the Gini coefficient, the lower the Gini coefficient, the better. You can see how the U.S. compares to other countries. For example, the U.K. At 3.99, the U.S. is a 0.434, and you can see the descending numbers, indicating that we as a country have more higher levels of inequality than other countries. So now this is a graph that really came out of a Denver Post article back just about a couple weeks ago. And this particular article was essentially shared about some research that was done by the National Retailers Association that looked at the level of home equity and the amount of home equity between 2010 and 2020. And what they found was this, that between 2010 and 2020, that's easy for me to say, there was $8.2 trillion of equity that was realized. And so what they did was to look at where did that go? And what they found was a couple of things. One, first of all, the median income for national income for the study was $67,521. Then I also threw in the Denver median income for the same time period, $82,000. And then what they did was to look at how did the equity, how was it distributed? And as you can see here at the bottom, that at the national level, we have the low income group essentially gaining 4% of that equity, the middle income group 26%, and high income group 70%. Compare that to Denver. Denver's a little more fairly distributed, 9% for low income, 33% for middle income, and high income is 57%. Now remember how I defined middle class and the distribution. Theoretically, 20% of the low income group low income group should have gotten 20% of that. The middle income group should have got 60%, as we said, and then high income group should have gotten 20%, if there was some kind of reasonable distribution of that. But obviously that you can see the difference, see the case there. Okay, let's look at the effects of a shrinking middle class. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we know that 2/3 of our American economy is just based on people buying things. We all go out and buy stuff. And the fact that it's shrinking really begins to constrain that group, that purchasing power of folks. And of course, obviously, that has an impact on the economy and fairness. Now, the question is, why? What explains this? What caused this? And we can see that we have, there are 5 areas. Globalization. Now, there's a lot of discussion about globalization and what it meant. And initially, the theory behind globalization was this. It's called comparative advantage. There were some economists that said, if we look at across the world, all the different countries have different kinds of expertise and skills. For example, some countries are low cost production, of course, driven by low wages. Some countries are very good at technology. For example, India, about 30, 40 years ago, decided that they wanted to be the kind of the experts in technology. So as a result, they really pushed computer scientists, training to computer scientists and so forth. So at one time they had the highest level of computer scientists per capita in the world. Well, what happened is, of course, when you have countries like China that would say, now the theory is that each of these economies would essentially do their own thing without help from government. Well, in fact, that didn't happen. China began to subsidize many of the products, and as a result, Chinese products came over. They were lower in cost, et cetera, although they weren't lower in they were lower in price, but not lower in cost. And so the subsidization of by governments really created this this political backlash. And so that's one area. The other is, of course, decrease in union membership. Union membership used to be 30% of the workforce, of the labor force. Now it's 10%. And of course, we know the leverage that unions had. And of course, part of it had to do with after the war, Second World War and so forth. There's a whole lecture around that. Financialization. And what that is all of us probably have experienced it to one degree or another. All that means is, what if we were to move our money, not necessarily to make productive things, but to kind of finance and refinance and this and so forth and so on. So for example, banks said, we would rather put our money into the refinancing of homes. You continue, and so that a whole industry developed around that. If you have a chance, there is a documentary called Flaw, and that we saw in class, and that really explains based on the housing crisis of 2008 and 9, really begins to look at and help you understand the issue of financialization. Then there was technological change, the impact of automation. Now, remember, technology was supposed to be a really, in a sense, a lifesaver for folks. It, in fact, has increased to the level of inequality. Then the last one is neoliberalism. And as I mentioned earlier, really looking at, we need to reduce the size of government and really look at redistribution of income and wealth to the wealthier section, and it's called supply side economics. We'll talk about it in just a minute. There it is. Really quickly, the question is, when you have a tax structure, who should benefit, if anybody? Right now we have what is called a progressive tax structure, but we won't get into that. But here's what the supply side economist said. It's called, and Arthur Laffer was an economist who said, hey, I have a great idea on really maximizing our economy. What do you propose? If you look at the rate, if you look at the graph here, on the x-axis you have the tax rate from 0 to 100%, and the tax revenue increases and so forth. He said there is a certain ideal rate that we need to find. We need to essentially provide tax. The ideal tax structure is to give tax breaks to, for example, corporations, because they make stuff. So what you do, the theory there is you provide the people who supply stuff, so hence the term supply side economics. So you give them the tax breaks, which is really giving them money. And what they will do is then they will take the money, they will then build new factories, or whatever the case happens to be, and what will happen there? They will create new jobs. Well, that was the theory behind it. What happened very quickly, and I'm just going to get in there were 3 presidents that implemented that philosophy: Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump. Now, Reagan said, hey, if we decrease taxes, we will decrease regulation. Ronald Reagan was famous for essentially the saying that government is not part of the problem, government is the problem. And all of a sudden, and we'll see that the issue of trust of government or lack thereof really began to increase. So then the impact of Reagan's tax policies were business activity grew, but it increased the wealth gap. Why? Because the upper end folks got the benefits. And then they ended up with, at that point in time, the highest federal debt. Well, there are two parts, deficit and debt. Deficit is the annual, you spend money, you spend more than you make. That's a deficit each year, per year. And then when you add up all the years, that's called the debt. George W. Bush, essentially, and I thought this was kind of interesting with Bush's. Bush said, you know, we want tax cuts now. This is 2001. It was the digital recession, essentially, that was happening at the time. He said, we can cut taxes and stimulate the economy. Oh, and by the way, during the Clinton administration, who was his predecessor, they had actually had a surplus, which had been the first surplus for several decades. And so he said, well, what we'll do is we will cut the taxes and we'll pay for it with the Clinton surplus, which I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. Take somebody else's surplus and spend it is really what he did. And so, well, the issue is, and we can look at from 2001 when Bush assumed office to 2009 when Obama took over. In that time period, that eight-year time period, you had several issues. One is, first of all, he had a debt without really any significant growth. Part of it is coming out of the digital crisis, and then of course eventually there was the housing crisis. But the average tax rates for top 1% fell by 4.1%. In other words, they paid 4.1% less in taxes, whereas everybody else paid only 2% less than others. And then the Trump tax cuts. Again, the theory is you cut the taxes, you'll stimulate the economy. But he also threw in increased tariffs. Tariffs is kind of like a hidden tax. That is, if a good comes in from another country, you put a tariff on that. It's kind of like a tax. Anyway, so at this point he added, and this is just in 2018, he added $2.29 trillion to the debt, and tariffs were one of the largest tax increases in the decade. So, point being, with supply side policies, they haven't really kind of generated the long-term impact that I think theoretically they were supposed to do. So now, what do we need to do? Is promoting economic growth, obviously the importance of the middle class, and distribution of resources, and the human capital development, and so forth. So I know we're supposed to be out of here. Let's see. Okay, we're okay. Just real quickly, let's look at, again, to kind of define some terms, gross domestic product, GDP. You hear that all the time. All that is just the value of all the goods and services that we generate here in the U.S. each year. You're going to see that it helps us understand income and wealth relationships, the difference between the two. And here's what they are. When you think about the goods and services that are generated and the money that's generated in selling them and so forth and so on, wages that are paid and so forth, when you put together, that's called the national income. There are two ways that people usually make money for the most part. One is what is called capital income. That is, the source of capital are investment income, sale of stock, those kinds of things. Whereas most of us the source of income are wages and salaries. In some cases, you have people who are retired who maybe have both. So that's really what is called our national income equation. Won't get into that. I think we're okay there. Now, just real quickly, I just want to show you something. When we look at what's the labor share, that is wages and salary share of that income, it's about 69%, whereas the capital share is about 31%. And that's been pretty steady across the board. Now, however, that's income. Income is the flow of money, your paycheck, wages, salaries that you get, etc. That's different than wealth, which is the value of the assets. For example, I may be somebody, for example, walking into this room, I'm going to clean the room, I get a wage to be able to do that. That's different than me owning the building, where people may pay rent. Okay, that's capital income for me. Now, according to the Center for Equitable Growth, if you look at, this is 2019, So if you look at the majority of the wealth in the U.S. is controlled by about 10% of the population. So for example, just real quickly, if you look at the deep red, you look at the top 1% and the growth that it's, the increase in wealth that it's had in the last, from 1989 to 2019, during that time period, about a 40-year period. And then look at the growth in the next group, the next 9%. So the top 1% and the next 9% essentially control about 55% of 60% of the wealth. And so you can see and then you have the upper 40%. So here you have the top 50% of the population. And you can see the distribution of the wealth there. So, what does all this mean? Well, wealth generates income. So, if I own a building, I get rent. I may get a paycheck also. And one of the essential issues around inequality is the tax rate that one pays. So, for example, most of us here who have wages or earn wages, essentially, we're taxed. You look at the tax table and so forth and so on, depending on what you make. The more you make, the more you pay. The way the wealthy are able to essentially stay wealthy is they sell stock, etc., and they pay what is called a capital gains tax. Capital gains tax is 15%, essentially, and you can see for the first 400, almost $500,000. After that, it goes up to 20%. Point being is that's what happens. That's how they maintain wealth. Now, that's not a bad thing. All I'm saying is, remember, the issue here is fairness. It doesn't have to do with, some people say, well, are you talking about class envy? And the answer is no. It's about fairness, is really what we're trying to point out here. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to go through this. The impact on the market, we talk about the market economy and so forth. Or people will say, I believe in the market system. Okay, the issue is we don't have such a thing as a perfect market. And I'm going to go to this. Okay, here's what I want to now shift into from the economic side to the political side. Again, I don't think there's any question right now that there is this divisiveness in our society. So the question is, what can we do about it, and why has it occurred? There really has been kind of this rise of antagonism and distrust of government, and again, partly driven by the comment I mentioned earlier that Ronald Reagan had made, that all of a sudden, up to that point, government, although 100% of the people didn't trust the government, but certainly the level of distrust increased during the administration. Then the rise of antagonism and distrust toward businesses. Now, there's another issue that has arisen, and it's pointed out by, she's actually she studies elections, Diana Mutz out of the University of Pennsylvania. She essentially looked at election results from 2012 and 2016. Part of the political rhetoric in 2016 was the fact that the economy was not doing well. Actually, that wasn't true. That certain groups were not doing well. Actually, that wasn't true. At least not for some groups. The issue really was a sense of what social psychologists call social dominance. Because of the shift in demographics and because of the shift in the population, essentially folks were saying, okay, wait a minute. There's been a shift from the rise of the minority majority. Social dominance theory says that you have a hierarchy of groups. And the question, who's going to be on top? Who's going to be the top, on top of the hierarchy? And so they say, well, it might as well be us. And so what happens when you begin to lose that sense of control? So her research points out to the fact that it's really more about the sense of losing control than it was about economics. That really contributed towards the sense of alienation. It's one of the issues that we're dealing with now. So how do we protect, looking at protecting democracy? The only one I'm going to cover there is the second one, Citizens United. Citizens United was a Supreme Court case that essentially was brought because to essentially they took at that time Feingold and who was a senator from Arizona. I'm spacing his. Okay, thank you. Political scientists would know. John McCain and Russell Feingold, essentially, there was a law passed that essentially controlled the level of political spending, the amount of money you could spend, you could provide to political action groups. The Supreme Court said, well, wait a minute. Corporations, and they were essentially really kind of focusing on corporations who had obviously a lot of money to give. The Supreme Court said, well, wait a minute, corporations are people too. It's interesting. I mean, have you ever had lunch or dinner or a glass of wine with a corporation? So anyway, they're people too. Therefore, they should have unlimited levels of spending, right? And so so as a result of that, you had super PACs that were formed. Super PACs meaning that you could contribute any amount of money you want, and you didn't have to give people your name. And so that I think is one of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of undermining our democracy. A real concern. Okay, real quickly then I want to go through each of those 4 years. What I would recommend for public policy strategies. One is under ensuring economic fairness, again, maybe it's all about fairness, is to really look at increasing education and training opportunities to deal with technological change. And I won't get into the specific. Here in Colorado last year, passed a law that essentially begins to deal with that. It's called HB 21-1330. Lawrence Katz from Harvard said, and this is really, for me, part of the key, is how do you integrate technology, education, and training? We traditionally have looked at that as kind of silos without folks talking to each other. And then leveraging technology to provide broadband access to citizens, regardless wherever you live. Doesn't make any difference, or shouldn't make any difference where you live. You should have access to broadband. That is a key to success in the 21st century. And of course, using big data to solve political, social, and economic problems. That's part of the data science piece that we're working on here at CU Denver. Then the pillar 2, promoting economic growth, is integrating knowledge and base critical thinking skills, university education, and really looking at practical skills. And all that means is this. How do we look at a traditional higher education institution as we are here at CU Denver? How do we begin to integrate some of the practical skills, for example, that come out of things like technical schools, et cetera? How do we bridge those kinds of ideas? How do we, we should encourage companies, to provide higher levels of resources for employment and training and development. Actually, over the last several years, companies have reduced the level of training and development funds, which really is kind of ironic because of the increasing change in technology and so forth, and the workforce. Focus on tax policies that focus on expanding the middle class. Deal with the Colorado paradox, as I mentioned, and one of the ways to do that is what we call growing your own. That is, for example, in your community, focus the resources you have on growing your own folks. Yes, it's okay for folks to come out, but you need to focus on the folks who are there. Actually, Paul Romer, who is a Colorado native and Nobel Prize winner, came up with the concept of what he called growing your own model of that. So, And then building a talent economy that promotes smart growth, not just unfettered growth, but rather smart growth through continuous improvement by balancing talent development and technology. See, I think that's a challenge we have as a society. We have a tendency to kind of look at silos, but let's do this cross-functional thing. How can we work together to be able to improve that and have an ongoing sense of there's a continuous improvement that needs to occur. You're never satisfied with where you are. That becomes a psychological issue. Then, pillar 3, eliminating citizen alienation through, I think, civic engagement and leadership. There's several foundations in the last several years that have begin to deal with that, where they're providing support for civic engagement and leadership development, where you're reaching out to the community. The key is really reaching out to the communities, whether you're in a predominantly minority community, a neighborhood, or if you're in the rural area. You know, there needs to be some discussion and some reaching out to those communities. And then finally, with protecting democracy is really, in my judgment, transparency in political, financial, and other resource contributions. That is, we should know who's contributing what. The question I always ask is, why would you not want people to know, that you're providing funds to, and that's okay. This is a free country. You should be able to donate to whomever you want. That should be, but in all fairness, is we should know how much that is and who you are. So, that's it. Thank you. Any questions, Ellie, from the group?
There's lots of enthusiasm. There's a lot of hello from Fort Worth, Texas.
Oh.
Jason Wardrop says good
Oh,
afternoon.
all right.
Yeah. Not so many questions yet, but I'll ask.
Okay, very good. Any questions here? Comments? Don't be shy. Oh, Michael?
Yeah, I'll start us off, Steve. Thanks so much. You covered a lot of ground here. I guess as someone who studies in American politics, my question, I haven't thought it fully through yet, is about the U.S. federal system and what the role of, in your talk, you focused more on federal policies and data on the United States. But then in some of your policy recommendations, you had a Colorado bill, for example, in there. So I guess I'm just curious, one, how much, and maybe if you could speak to how much variation is there in economic inequality across the United States? Is it more in Colorado or California? Is there a lot of variation there? And then two, what do you see as the role of state governments in trying to address inequalities, or is it primarily a federal kind of, should the federal government have more control or influence through whether it's tax policy or other kinds of changes that the federal government might impose? Just I'm curious as to your thoughts on kind of the role of state versus federal governments here in the United States to addressing some of the inequalities that you've discussed. Okay,
Great question. First question is inequality across the country, and there's no question about it. If you look at the data, you'll have, for example, if you look at a map, color map and so forth, you'll see that generally you'll see this is the top part of the United States. In the Midwest, at this point, there's still the wages are still pretty high, relatively high. California, of course, is higher. They do very well, and of course the Northeast, east part does well. Although there's a lot of the Rust Belt areas that essentially have lost a lot of jobs and so forth, and population shifts. It's the South that is really, if you look at the map, and if you look at blue being relatively, that higher levels, yellow kind of being in between, and red being the lowest levels of inequality. That's where you'll find that. All you say, it's really pretty stark, actually. There is contiguous on the map. that from now upper parts of Florida, and then if you go up through about North Carolina, South Carolina, and then you go down west, Georgia, especially Mississippi, Alabama, all of those. And ironically, those are the folks who essentially don't believe in federal intervention because they say, no, we can do our own thing. And we don't want that kind of help, et cetera, where in fact they are the least, the highest levels of inequality, income inequality there. So to your second question, Mike, about the role of federal and state government, I think it has to be a partnership. I've worked on both sides. And so there really has to be, the role of federal government traditionally has always been, okay, we can identify issues, we can provide some resources, but they're only temporary. So for example, when you go after a federal grant, it's usually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years at the most. Because the idea is it's supposed to be seed money to be able to develop something. But then the state itself should pick up that because hopefully they plan for that. So in my judgment, and then the flip side of that is, quite frankly, many ideas, innovative ideas, come from the states. I've seen that a lot. And so really there's a sense of, here's some new ideas, some innovative ideas, entrepreneurship and so forth and so on. Federal government, can you provide some financial support to be able to do that? And then we'll pick it up after that. So I think there has to be a partnership, and that's quite frankly has been at least the last 25 years, of that the importance of, quite frankly, since the Clinton administration, because he, as a former governor, he knew how to, the importance of federal involvement, but also state involvement too. So great question. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So thank you for the presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Great. So my question was about neoliberalism, and based on that one slide you had, the failure of supply side economics. How is that still attempted, and why is it to get to one of your earlier points, kind of this false idea that there is such a thing as pure capitalism, or pure competition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you were also talking about tariffs, which is basically similar to policies of mercantilism, right? So this overlapping of these economic systems, how do we address that? Like, how do we continually point out the failure of these policies that continue to wreak havoc?
Boy, that's a great question. What I think when you do, the first thing you have to do, when you when you're dealing with some kind of addiction, the first thing you have to do is admit you have the addiction. And I think that's what we have to do. That is, we have to admit there is no such thing really as a free market. A free market, by definition, neoclassical definition, is easier entry and into the market. No one group controls the market. I maximize my profit, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the principles behind it, quote, neoclassical free market economy. That doesn't exist. The closest we have is, for example, you've all been to farmers markets, right, where they have fruit and vegetables and so forth and so on. Okay, think about this. You have somebody who's selling apples. I'm going to charge $1 an apple. And then you have, all of a sudden, somebody else in another booth has some apples too. So I charge $1. I want to charge more, but I'll charge $1. And this person over here charges $1 for apples. So you say, we know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy his apples. So I go over and buy his apples and put them in there. And now I'm the only provider. So I'll charge $1.25. Nobody's going to argue with that because I control the market. That's what happens. Monopolies and so forth that happen, oligopolies and so forth that happen in our system. So therefore, you have to admit that. So therefore, provide, how do you deal, for example, when you have a monopoly? Now, there's some things that are natural monopolies, like Excel. Not everybody can build all the energy, the infrastructure, and so forth. So therefore, you need some kind of control. But I think it's, look at the technology group. Apple and Microsoft and Google what happens when you have an entrepreneur developing a product that they perceive to be kind of competition. We'll buy them out. Hey, pay you $5 million for your project. I'm a young entrepreneur. Hey, I'll take it. Then I just shut it down. So it's an issue of really being, first, honest, and two, is developing the systems to be able to deal with those what are called imperfect competition. But that's right, imperfect competition is what it's called. Mm-hmm.
We have online questions.
All right.
Yay. So this one comes from C. Menard. The decrease in training and development that you mentioned, is this the internal training and development provided by companies to employees? How does does it relate to the Great Resignation?
First of all, that's a great question. Yes, it does relate to the internal financing of training and development. And yes, I think that's part of the Great Resignation. In fact, it's interesting. I'm going to do a talk on the Great Resignation here in about 3 or 4 weeks. But yes, it is, because companies said, we need to reduce the amount of what we pay for as far as talent and development because it's impacting our bottom line. And all of a sudden, employees are saying, well, wait a minute, the development opportunities that I had in this company, I thought would really help me move to the next level, et cetera. If you don't have it, you don't move. So yes, I think yes to both of those questions.
As a follow-up.
Okay.
I can't see behind me, but related question, do you see T and D as the responsibility of employers, governments, or individuals? Which can most effectively accomplish it?
In the context of a company, because you think about the reason that companies pay for training is to be able to help their employees become more productive. That's what's called human capital development. And I think probably some share of the company for sure, and maybe depending on how successful they are. That is, by that I mean this: people, you pay for an employee's training with an agreement that they will complete whatever is necessary to help you as a company do better, to improve efficiency and so forth and so on. If they choose not to, there needs to be some kind of payback. So I think it is, and the government side of it is really all about the general labor force. How do we, for example, from a general labor force perspective, one is, do we have the talent in our population to be able to fill jobs, the kinds of jobs, for example, that are changing all the time. So there is a role for government. There's no question about that.
We've got another.
Okay.
Miriam Ordinas asked, can you speak on medical debt and its impacts on the middle class?
Oh yeah. Well, medical debt it's one of the primary causes for bankruptcy in families. And so, yes, there's no question about that. So the question is, what can we do as a society to provide some kind of support, for that? Now, by definition, medical debt is money that was paid out because of some kind of health issue, medical issue, et cetera. And I think probably, and depending on the level of debt, probably needs perhaps some kind of support for that. Now, I had to think more about what that means in terms of where it comes from, how much, and so forth and so on. But probably conceptually, some kind of support makes sense. Now, for example, it could be a tax break. It could be cash. But those are the things that have to be played out. Any other questions?
There's a lot of thank yous.
Okay, great, excellent. Very good. Anybody else? Well, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.